KETV News Watch 7, chronicling the stories impacting our community. Stories making a difference. Stories that matter to you. This is KETV News Watch 7's Chronicle.
We've said we want everybody. We want to grow the future and we want to grow the conservative movement.
So is that the secret to winning this election in November? And will that conservative push in a traditionally red state be just what Ben Sasse needs to become Nebraska's next U.S. Senator? Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Rob McCartney.
And I'm Brandy Peterson. This is a special Commitment 2014 edition of KETV News Watch 7's Chronicle. Today we are focusing on Mike Johan's Senate seat that will soon be up for grabs.
And we invited both Republican Ben Sasse and Democrat Dave Domina to spend an hour each with us, discussing the topics that matter most to them and to you.
We flipped a coin to see which interview would air first, and today we are talking with Sasse. Last week we talked with Domina. That interview is online on KETV.com right now.
Okay, first a little background on Ben Sasse. He is a fifth-generation Nebraskan. Grew up in Fremont, and then he went east wrestling at Harvard. Earned his Ph.D. from Yale.
After graduation, he worked for a Boston consulting firm, helping and advising leaders and companies in crisis. He also served as startup chief of staff for Nebraska Congressman Jeff Fortenberry and was appointed to multiple posts by former President George W. Bush. Most recently, he served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services.
Now, many people have labeled him as the Tea Party candidate.
But he describes himself as a conservative who represents Nebraska values.
Believe robustly in limited government and defined constitutional freedoms because I believe the center of life is in our Nebraska communities.
And Sasse says he is not afraid to reach out to Democrats, too.
Yeah, just listen to what he had to say right after winning the primary.
Oddly, I was attacked in this campaign, often in print and occasionally by live phone calls and occasionally on commercials, for having talked to Democrats before. Well, I'll tell you what, we're going to keep talking to Democrats. We're going to do it a lot more because we want to win them to the right side of the fight.
Well, a week after winning the primary, Sasse stepped down from his job as president of Midland University.
He was at the helm when Dana College closed and half the student body transferred to what was then known as Midland Lutheran College.
The main thing we want the Dana students to know is that they're going to be totally accepted here at Midland, and yet at the same time we want to be mindful of the fact that they were choosing Dana as their community, and we still want them to have a sense of that continuity.
Since then, Midland has created a 4-year graduation guarantee, launched an MBA program, and added 11 new varsity athletic teams. And right now, Sasse is in the middle of a 93-county tour of the state, meeting and reaching out to Nebraskans.
Latest poll by CBS News, New York Times, and YouGov in July shows that it may be working. He's leading Dave Domina by 23 points. Margin of error here, 4.4%.
Sasse also has the fundraising advantage. A quick look at the Federal Election Commission website shows Domina has raised $223,977 compared to Sasse, who's taken in more than $1 million.
Okay, with all that being said, joining us this morning to talk about his Senate run is Ben Sasse.
Good morning and welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So very busy, 93 counties. What do you want Nebraskans to know about you, first and foremost?
You know, I'm a dad, and Melissa and I have 3 little kids, and we believe we have a moral obligation to leave a great and free and opportunity-filled country to the next generation. I don't think Washington's the center of life. I think Nebraska is the center of life, and Washington exists to provide a framework for ordered liberty, but life is lived in our communities, and jobs are created here, and I think we need to rediscover and reaffirm that sense of shared values of the local. It's what the American founders believed in. It's what we talk about on the trail, and it's comforting that it's what Nebraskans believe all across our 93 counties.
If you want to go work in Washington, I mean, you would have to work there in the Senate. Dissatisfaction with Congress is tremendous levels right now. Why would you even want to be part of that?
Yeah, I mean, I was with a senator the other day who joked that the opinion polls have the Congress at a 9 to 14% approval rating, and he said it feels like they must be grading on the curve because it shouldn't be nearly that high. A lot is broken in Congress. This isn't a calling that we're pursuing because we need a new job. This is because Washington exists to do some fundamental things to provide for what we need in terms of the common defense and economic vitality that has entitlement programs and promises that add up mathematically, and we owe our kids better than that. So I want to fight for the things that Nebraskans believe in, but if the people in Nebraska give us this calling in 5 weeks, we don't plan to move to D.C. We'd commute because we want to keep raising our kids right here.
How do you do that? How do you build up the power, if you will, in D.C. to be a strong senator and have a voice, but at the same time stay in touch with Nebraskans and your family?
Right. So we've spent the better part of 7 months at one point in the primary living off of a campaign bus, and we kept our family engaged in that. Our kids are 13, 10, and 3, and I care a lot about the future of this country, and I care a lot about representing Nebraska values in Washington, but I wasn't going to sacrifice a year of my responsibilities as a dad and engagement with my kids. So we took them with us, and we're pretty decent at living as a family on the road and viewing it as a shared project. But if we have this calling after November 4th, we're going to go back and forth a lot. The Senate traditionally meets mostly on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and I think most of the problems that we see in Washington tend to be with people who lose touch with the real values of the communities they're from, and they move to D.C. like it's the center of everything. My neighbors in Fremont, Nebraska are my friends and neighbors and the people I want to be accountable to. My primary community wouldn't be people in Washington, D.C. You want to treat them with respect and work together on shared projects, but encourage them to get back to their communities as well.
Well, what is the biggest problem with Capitol Hill then? I mean, you say the dissatisfaction is tremendously high. You don't want to be there all the time. You got to think there's something wrong with it. What is wrong with it?
You know, I think we have too many incumbents who believe that Washington is where they need to be, and they need to be a part of some club, and that becomes their community, and they're so addicted to incumbency that they have difficulty telling the truth about the basic challenges we face. We've talked a lot on the trail about the entitlement crisis, and it's a dangerous thing to talk about because people can run attack ads against you and distort your positions, but we talk constantly about the fact that ultimately, for people my age and younger, not for current retirees, but for people my age and younger, we're going to need to have major reform of these entitlement programs. When the retirement age was set at age 65 in 1935, our life expectancy was only 62. It was an outlier program for unusually long-lived widows. Today, through wonderful advances of public health and medical technology and better diet and other issues, we have a shared life expectancy of more than 81 years. That's great news, but we need to recalibrate these programs. I want to be clear because we had a lot of attack TV run against us over the last year. I think that we need to protect the programs for today's retirees and those near the retirement age. But for people middle age and younger, we need to have an honest conversation about making them solvent for the next generation. And that's a dangerous thing. And your question was, what's wrong in D.C.? I think there are far too many people who go to Washington and they're not comfortable talking honestly about the big problems we face because that might mean they might lose a re-election at some point. Well, you know what I find across the state? Our people are serious people. They're far more serious than a lot of national journalists give them credit for, and they're more serious than incumbent politicians give them credit for. They'd like to see us talk about the big issues that really confront us, and we need an economy that's growing again, and part of that has to do with a budget process that's honest, and Washington hasn't had that for well over a decade.
So if some of those incumbents are reelected, new people are brought in, how do you make them listen to you as a new senator? You know, the reality, so first of all, I'm a guy who has been a part of a lot of crisis projects, and I'm a big believer in the fact that data and reality ultimately is where the game will be. So you want to skate to where the puck is going to be, and you treat people with dignity and respect. But I think we're on a pathway toward a Greek-style debt crisis. If you think about what's happened in Greece over the course of the last decade, they had incumbent politicians who would make promises and pass these phony budgets that no adults thought added up. I mean, all across the political spectrum of Greece, from right to left. Everybody was voting for these bogus budgets, and they knew they were bogus. Pardon me. International debt and credit markets would come to these politicians and say, what are you guys doing? That math doesn't make any sense. And literally the politicians responded with things like, I know, you're right. We should get serious at some point. But the Greek politician would say, I can't do it this year. I'm up for re-election. We can't be honest. But trust us, down the road we'll eventually get serious. They didn't do that, and finally the debt and credit market said, you know what, now we need to charge you an interest rate commensurate with your irresponsibility. And their entire economy came screeching to a halt, and the unemployed population in the under 30 age cohort now, not kids in school, right, but people under age 30 seeking jobs, is almost 68% in Greece. Well,
let me ask you this. You mentioned there's too many incumbents in Washington. I mean, right now you think you have the answers, but what say if you get elected in 6 years, would you run again? And do you believe in term limits?
I absolutely believe in term limits. I don't believe in self-term limiting because right now not enough Democrats believe in term limits, and given some of the seniority and committee process rules, it would be foolish for my party to just unilaterally disarm and self-term limit. But I've pledged to the people in Nebraska that I'll introduce or co-sponsor legislation for a constitutional amendment my first week in office in favor of term limits.
You kind of mentioned the two different parties there. Is there too much divisiveness? And if you are the Tea Party candidate, and I guess I'll let you answer that, are you too far right to work with that other side to get things done?
You know, I think what you find if you travel with us on our bus is we have support from all across the political spectrum. We have lots of Democrats and lots of independents supporting us, and in our primary, certain journalists nationally tried to impose labels on us that really just are national labels that didn't make a lot of sense in Nebraska. We won 92 of 93 counties in the primary. We ended up doubling up all of the other candidates in our race, and we had some really great candidates in my primary, and we won by 27%. When you go to those 93 counties or the 92 we won a whole broad cross-section of people. I don't know exactly what Tea Party means, but in Nebraska counties it seems like it means something about urgency. People know Washington is big and broken, and folks who are most worried about the lack of urgency in Washington to deal with the big problems often end up getting a label like that. But I've always said we wanted everybody. We want small business people, and we want pro-life people, and people who want to defend every constitutional right that our founders properly recognized that we get from nature. We want support from everybody because I want to talk about the bigger problems that face our kids. I want us to be looking forward to the future, and I believe that Nebraska Republicans and Nebraska Democrats care about their kids, and they want to pass along something special, and I want to talk to all those people who want to tackle the big problems.
You know, we're going to get into several of the issues, or a number of issues during this hour. I want to just touch on one real quickly. You and your wife, Melissa, homeschool your kids. What's wrong with the public school system?
Oh, the public school system is often great. We're for all of the above education. I went to public school, Fremont High School. I went to Lutheran Elementary School. Melissa went to public school. She's been an inner city public school teacher. We've sent our kids to lots of different kinds of schools. Right now, homeschooling is a great thing for us because we're mobile a lot of the time. And as we've been across this whole state, we didn't want either our kids to be missing school all the time, or on the other hand, us to be missing them a lot of the time when we're on the trail. So I believe we need more choices for parents. Parents are the primary responsible party for the bringing up of our kids, and I think we need more great Lutheran schools, Catholic schools, public schools, and people that use flex school or hybrid models. I'm for more of all of the above.
Would you support tax credits then for private schools or even homeschooling?
I'm definitely in favor of school choice. I think we need to do a better job of making sure that all American families and all Nebraska families have as many options available to them as possible.
Well, we're going to touch on many of these things in greater detail, but right now it's time for us to take a short break.
We'll be right back.
Must be eradicated, and the U.S. is obviously going to have to be the leader of that international coalition.
Last week, President Obama made the case for U.S. involvement in the region and tried to rally the international community.
During a meeting at the UN Security Council, President Obama declared the world at a crossroads between war and peace. He vows to lead a global coalition and is trying to gather support.
Welcome back. You are watching a one-hour special edition of KETV Newswatch 7's Chronicle. We're talking with Ben Sasse, who is running for U.S. Senate.
Mr. Sasse, first let's talk more about ISIS. Do you support the president's actions?
We need the president to have a more comprehensive story so that we understand what the long-term strategy is. We need actions that make sense, but we surely need to move against ISIS, and we need to do it in a bipartisan, bicameral, multi-branch way. So the president needs authorization from the Congress, but we need to move. ISIS is a dangerous threat. The president needs to provide a more coherent solution, though.
So you supported the attacks in Syria? Airstrikes.
I support a long-term plan to eradicate ISIS. Right now, we don't have that. We just have some pieces of ingredients, but I definitely support the unique war powers of a president in a time of crisis, and we have that. But we need a better comprehensive plan from the administration. We haven't gotten that.
If you were a senator sitting there right now, would you vote for boots on the ground?
We need the administration to come to the Congress explaining what is needed to win. We need to not make speeches that are primarily driven by the politics of different domestic coalitions and what you said to them in 2008 versus 2012. And right now, too much of the president speaking about this is about him trying to make sure he allies a bunch of his interest groups at home. We need to not start with the question of means. We need to start with the question of ends. And ISIS is a bloodthirsty terrorist organization that kills women and children and doesn't abide by the rules of war. We've got vacuums around the world, ungoverned spaces. Post-1989, you look at northern Syria, northern Iraq now, it's a lot like what developed in Afghanistan in the late 1990s, and we need to eradicate ISIS. We need the president to come up with and lead with a comprehensive plan, and he needs to bring it to the Congress. He hasn't done that yet.
You mentioned ungoverned areas around the world. What do you see as America's role? Should we be going to every hotspot on the globe and being a global police officer, if you will, or should we sit back and say, okay, not being isolationist, but sit back and say, okay, we're going to protect our interests, but terrorism's been around forever, so you figure it out.
Yeah, I think there's a middle between those two positions, because we absolutely, in your latter option, should start with what is the U.S. interest, but I don't believe that means sitting back. I think at the end of the day, we are the sole global superpower, whether we like it or not. We sit just a few miles away from Offutt here, and we all remember, those of us who grew up here, the Cold War of 1948 to 1989 and the bomb drills we'd have in elementary school and junior high. The Cold War was a terrible thing, and it is wonderful that President Reagan led us to victory in that Cold War. One of the things we don't talk about enough as a people is the unanticipated consequences of the end of the Cold War being the rise of these ungoverned spaces around the world. Before 1989, there really weren't any places like northern Syria, northern Iraq right now, like Afghanistan in the late 90s, because every place in the world fit in some sort of domino-like pecking order of Soviet satellite-influenced regions and U.S. allies. What we have now is a vacuum. We have vacuums, and we need to be sure that we protect U.S. interests by forward-leaning and being sure that we're supporting our allies. We need a world where our allies trust us, that when we give our word, we mean it. We need a world where our enemies know to fear us, and if we draw a red line, we mean it. We need to be cautious about drawing such red lines, but when we do, we need to be resolute. And so if you think about, I won't take us too far afield, but if you think about what's happening in the Ukraine right now, no one in Nebraska supports boots on the ground in the Ukraine, obviously. And yet, when you talk to Nebraskans, they're worried. They know that Putin 5 and 8 and 10 years from now is going to be a more dangerous global competitor than even today. And how did we get to this place? We got to this place because we ultimately didn't keep our word. We made pledges in the mid-1990s when President Clinton rightly led us, being worried about international nuclear proliferation. He led us to help the Ukraine and urged the Ukraine to give their nuclear materials back to Moscow, because we didn't want all these nations to have nuclear materials if we weren't sure they could really protect them. But we pledged through NATO that we would deploy anti-ballistic missile systems in Poland and the Czech Republic. Under this administration, we ultimately didn't keep our word, and that's why Putin was able to gobble up this territory. We need to be firmer, that when we need to be very cautious before we make commitments, but when we make them, we should keep them.
How do we find that balance when we were talking about the economy, hope to continue talking about that? We have all of these issues here at home that require money. How do you balance that with fulfilling all of these promises overseas?
Well, first of all, the first duty of the federal government is to protect us from enemies, foreign and domestic. Washington tries to do too many things. It does them too ineffectively. It tries to centrally plan many aspects of life that you can't, and I'm sure in our economic discussion we'll talk about regulatory overreach. But at the level of national security and border security, that is fundamentally a Washington responsibility. We can't do that from Lincoln. We can't do that from Douglas County. You can't do that from the Arlington School Board. So this is a central government federal responsibility at the national level, and we need to spend whatever it takes to be sure we're fulfilling the national security obligations of the U.S. government. Let's be clear, there's lots of waste at different places in our foreign policy, in our national security, and our defense spending, but we need to be clear that we fulfill our obligations for national security.
Let me ask you this then. If you're sitting there in Washington, in the Senate, and we have U.S. Stratcom right here, we have Offutt right here, how do you rank their importance And how do you decide between them and some domestic policies that are relevant, that are not, as you know, overwasted or government waste that you have to have?
Right.
How do you make that decision?
Well, I think, first of all, there are three categories of federal spending that it's useful to think in terms of. There are entitlement promises, things that happen outside of the annual appropriation. So Social Security, Medicare, now big parts of Obamacare. Then there are discretionary parts of the budget, and I think it's useful to segment that between national security and domestic policy discretionary issues. We're on a pathway toward the entitlement budget gobbling up everything. So there isn't typically a trade-off between defense and one other thing. What's really happening is defense and all other domestic policy discretionary priorities are all being pinched by long-term entitlements. I mean, just to put a historical underpinning on this, when JFK was president, 52% of all federal spending was national security. 1% was health entitlements. Today, under President Obama, health entitlements are larger than defense spending at about 24 to 22%. And when you look 15 years in the future on government projections, entitlements will eclipse 70% of the budget. So the reality is we need to do entitlement reform so that we don't squeeze every other priority: education investments, basic R&D, infrastructure investments, and national security.
So would you rank? Could you rank the military number one?
Oh, I do think national security is the fundamental responsibility of the federal government. It has to be listed first.
Talking about the economy and specifically education a little bit, you've got a lot of degrees from very good schools. We just had a poll come out that said today's Gen Xers will have 6 times as much debt as their parents, a lot of that student loan debt. How do you do that? How do you balance getting a good education for that good job to make a good living, but having all of this debt you're paying off for years? What do we do?
It's a great question, and there is a big worry, understandably, for families about what is happening with student loan indebtedness. I think it was about 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, for the first time, student loan debt eclipsed total credit card debt in the nation. We've got a problem. But even bigger than that problem is the fact that a huge share of all the student loan debt is to people who never finished college. So we have way too many institutions of higher education that exist for their own inertia of motion, for their own internal workforce, and not nearly enough for their students, for their customers, providing them with the education and training they need to become lifelong learners and to be able to navigate an economy that will be increasingly complex as people go forward. Some recent data shows that over half of all American workers today work for a firm that they didn't work for when President Obama was elected in November of '08. A majority of people have changed jobs. We all know this is a common experience for kids. Kids graduating from our college aren't just going to change jobs, they're going to change industries 3 times in their first decade. But middle class and middle age and older folks are still changing jobs at remarkably increasing rates. We need more thoughtful investment in higher education and in job retraining programs. Right now, Washington has too many programs that are ineffective, and we should have some big arguments about whether or not there may need to be increased investment in the future, but we need these institutions to exist for the good of kids, not for the good of their own inertia of motion and for the arms race of ever bigger and better health clubs at colleges and universities.
Well, piggybacking on Brandy's question, we're talking $1 trillion in outstanding student loan debt. One of the solutions being thrown out there is lowering the interest rate, forgiving some of the interest rate, if you will, on some of these student loans. Do you support that?
It becomes a hot button issue about who's promising what to whom today. I think we should fix the long-term trajectory of the problem before we get to this issue of how you handle this moment, because the reality is the curve on this is completely unsustainable. The problem isn't unsustainable for the people who have the debt today. The biggest problem is that we don't have a long-term plan for higher education to innovate for the knowledge economy. There are all sorts of examples of places where we're turning out. I want to be clear, Randy joked about having too many degrees. My mom would be hard. I ended up going to Harvard just because they had a really weak wrestling team, and I wasn't a good enough athlete to play for the Huskers. So I went to Harvard to play sports more than because I thought it had superior academics. So I am a big defender of a broad-based liberal arts education. I want to be clear about that. I don't set that opposed to vocational training. But if you look at the deficits in vocational training that we have right now, it's striking. You go to Norfolk and you talk to people at Nucor, they can't hire enough welders. Median household income in Nebraska is in the low $50,000 range, 50 to 52-ish, I think. Individual worker median wage is in the high 30,000s range. In Norfolk, they have a huge share of employees at the Nucor plant that make more than $78,000 a year, and they can't hire enough welders for those plants right now, those mills. And we don't have enough training programs for those kinds of things. We need more diversification of the job retraining and higher education supply side. We need to not start by having politicians pander about, I'll promise a bunch of people free stuff today, but not address the structural problems we face.
But for working families who have already completed their degrees, switching jobs or switching careers or not, when you're faced with, I don't know if Social Security is going to be there, should I save for retirement, but I have all this student loan debt, and I have my kids, should I save for their college? What do you tell them? What should they do?
Yeah, what we do is we start by having politicians that don't pretend you can solve every problem in an individual household's life, but we need a growth economy for all Nebraska and all American families. The reality is we need more economic opportunity for everybody. I'm not a Republican because I care all that much about the marginal tax rates of the richest 1%. I'm a believer, as you had in your segment coming in, I'm a believer in limited government and in constitutional freedoms because I believe in the dignity of people to do great stuff. But that requires a Washington that keeps its commitments, that pays its bills, that lives within an honest budget like we do in Nebraska. Our state government doesn't spend money we don't have. If Washington would have more predictability, less regulatory uncertainty, we could have a growing economy that helps that family and every family. But politicians shouldn't pretend that they're, a social worker and doctor who can solve every problem. We need a structural commitment to economic growth that enables every Nebraska family to get ahead.
Ask you Affordable Care Act. Many people we talk with say they don't think the whole thing will be repealed. There will be an effort to try to repeal it, but Obamacare, as it's called colloquially, it just needs major modifications, they say. What do you think, and what modifications would you make?
Yeah, I think Obamacare is fundamentally unsustainable. We're going to end up one of two places in the future. We're going to do real health care reform, which we need. I want to be clear. Too often my party talks like the Republicans are against Obamacare or against the Affordable Care Act, and we think the status quo in American health care 5 years ago worked. I don't think that. We need fundamental reform, or we're going to drift toward a European-style socialized health care system. That's where Obamacare ultimately leads, because the math inside Obamacare is bogus. You remember Senators Clinton and Obama in the Democratic primary in 2008 had a long debate about whether there were 45 million or 47 million uninsured. It was sort of goofy, given that there are 310 million Americans and fully 80 million of our neighbors go through a period of uninsurance in any given calendar year, a quarter of the population. Well, why is that happening? It's not primarily because of poverty and socioeconomics, and it's not primarily because of pre-existing medical conditions. Only about 4 million people have an uninsurable pre-existing condition. It's about 1.5% of the population. I empathize with that problem, and I believe in social safety nets. We should tackle it. But the main reason that we actually have so much growing uninsurance is because we have a tax accident where Washington in the 1940s picked winners and losers, and if you work for a very large firm, you get a tax break for your health insurance policy, and if you're a Nebraska farmer or rancher or small business person, you don't get the same options. We need to, and people change jobs more frequently and more rapidly than they used to. And so that's the main reason we have growing uninsurance. We need to fix the tax code. We need to get Washington out of the business of picking winners and losers. We need to do a whole host of things that really are health care reform, some of them related to the long-term solvency of Medicare for people who are not yet in the program. But Obamacare, and we can unpack why this is, Obamacare is not a structurally solvent program. It's built on fake math. One simple example is when they passed it, they raised the taxes immediately, and in the budget, they had 10 years of tax increases, but the program's benefits didn't start until after year 4. And then they said, look, in a 10-year budget window, the math balances. Well, you only had 6 years of expenditures, and you had 10 years of tax increases, and then it's supposedly balanced. When you get to year 11, the thing is totally structurally insolvent and drawing out of the general revenues of the program. You can't centrally plan 18% of the economy. We need to empower doctors and nurses.
Would you vote to repeal it?
Absolutely.
Okay.
But I want to not just repeal it, I want to repeal it and replace it. There's a lot that's broken in healthcare, and there are people suffering, and we need to help them. There's a lot more that government should be doing smarter and better, but Obamacare makes the problems worse, not better.
Well, we are just getting started. We have another 30 minutes here to come on KETV Newswatch 7 Chronicle.
Yeah, up next we're going to discuss Social Security, the minimum wage, and more.
I think for people my age and younger, we need to have an honest conversation about the fact that Washington thinks they're an eternal Santa Claus and they promise things that don't add up. Those at or near the retirement age need to be protected, but there need to be benefit adjustments for people my age and younger for sure.
U.S. Republican Senate candidate Ben Sasse here talking with us this morning about the issues.
So, what do we need to do to preserve Social Security for people our age and younger?
We need to start having an honest conversation about the math. We talked a little bit about the increase in life expectancy from age 62 back in the 30s when the program was created to today. Our shared life expectancy is 81. It's great. I have a 3-year-old son. According to CDC tables, a male born in eastern Nebraska in 2011 has a 50-50 statistical chance of seeing age 100. That is great news. Everywhere except a world devoid of political leadership, and too often that's our world. He is not going to retire and then play 35 years of middle-class golf. I mean, the math just doesn't work. We had 16 workers per retiree when we set the retirement age. Now I think it's 2.8 workers per retiree. We have a demographic crisis inside these programs, and we need an honest conversation with middle-aged people and younger. And you know what I believe? One of the things that has inspired me on the trail is Nebraskans believe this. They're sick of sound bites and gotcha television. Paul Ryan, the former vice presidential Republican nominee, endorsed me early in the race. You can disagree with Paul, but don't claim he doesn't love his grandma because he wants to admit that for his and our kids we ought to talk about changing the retirement age so the program is structurally solvent. There are people who run attack ads against Paul Ryan across the country saying he wants to throw his grandma off a cliff. That's a dishonest kind of discourse, and people in Nebraska are fed up with it. They want to talk honestly about these programs because not just the people our age and younger who need them to be preserved for them. Again, we want to protect the people who are already in these programs. But my grandma and the Nebraskans I talk to that are over 65, they aren't just self-interested in their own Social Security check. They want to know that the programs are going to be there for the next generation. Our people are bigger-minded than our politicians most of the time.
You know, there's a thought that says you need to get politics out of the mix. I was looking up this issue, and the former director of the Office of Management and Budget said the arithmetic of the problem is very simple, actually, not difficult. Increase revenue, cut benefits, or a mix of the two. Just takes tinkering on both sides. And that's how they got it passed, significantly passed in '83, when the last time we cut the shortfall down. Tinkering on both sides, though, means working with the other side. Can this even happen?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I deeply believe in working with the other side. I mean, when you're debating policy and politics, when people treat each other with dignity, Howard Dean, the former Democratic presidential candidate and former governor of Vermont, he's become a friend of mine over the years because we've traveled the country debating the future of American policy and politics, and health policy in particular. And Governor Dean is wrong on lots and lots of issues. I mean, he believes in European-style socialized solutions to lots of problems, but I genuinely believe the guy loves his grandkids, sure, and he wants a great country for them, and we can debate the issues. Now, when you say what's the mix of the tinkering, the reality is we need a growth economy. I'd love to have the federal coffers expanding, but not because we need higher marginal tax rates. That's what I think is wrong about a lot of the debate, where people say if the two sides would just come together, everything would be fine. Well, I don't think Washington taxes too little. Nebraskans don't believe we need a tax increase. I don't ever speak in an ad hominem way about my opponent, but I mean, this is a kind of basic place where we disagree. My opponent believes we need tax increases. I don't think we do. I think Washington needs to be honest about prioritizing among the programs we have and among the great news of the fact that people are living longer, and so we should reform our entitlement programs, and I think Nebraskans believe that too.
Flip side then is cutting benefits.
No, I don't think so. I mean, define a cut. I don't think we're cutting benefits for today's retirees. I think we need to get to a long-term structurally solvent position where politicians don't play Santa Claus by promising things that can't add up. People, again, my son is 3. He is not going to retire at age 65 and receive public benefits for 35 years. The sooner we tell the truth about that, we should protect benefits for today's retirees, but for middle-aged people and younger, we should admit that we should over time be indexing age of entry into these public programs to life expectancy. It's a great thing that's happened. The only people who can't handle it are politicians who don't want to have an honest conversation but want to promise free stuff.
Does minimum wage have a role in this? Some would say that if you are giving people a little more to play with, they're not on welfare, they're not relying on the government, entitlements go down, they have more to invest in their own lives.
Yeah, so it's a fair conversation to have. Let's start by saying all of us want every Nebraska worker to be earning more money. But the best way to do that is by growing the opportunity pool, by growing the economy, not by taking away rungs on the ladder of opportunity. There are a bunch of things related to the reform that we need related to your question about people that we're trying to get off welfare and into the workforce. And we should look at the earned income tax credit, because I've had the experience on the trail multiple times this year of having single moms come up to me and say, I want to do the right thing. I want to get off welfare. I want to get back to work. I want my kids, when they come home from school, I don't want them to see me sitting on a couch watching television. I want them to see me as the one who was the breadwinner. The dinner we're going to eat tonight, I earned. It wasn't given to us by the government. Work isn't just about provision. It's also about the dignity of recognizing who people are. And we're made to be creative. We're made to serve our neighbors. We're made to provide for our kids. And I had a couple of these women tell me, I want to get back to work, and I've been offered jobs. I was in Falls City one time, and a gal was telling us I was offered 2 jobs last week, but I ultimately can't afford to take them because if I take this job at $12 or $13 an hour, I'll lose so much benefits in terms of the welfare programs that will immediately cliff out on me that it'll be like a $5,000 pay cut. I can't afford to do the right thing and go back to work.
If it's a level playing field and that minimum wage, we have a set minimum wage and it's raised, is that the answer?
No, I don't think so, because then a lot of those jobs might not exist. That's what we know. So of the whole population, only about 3%, I think the most recent data shows, only about 3% of people are earning minimum wage. And of the folks who are earning minimum wage, 89% of them are not the primary wage earner in their family. They're often a spouse or a child or a nephew or a niece that's living in a multi-generation family. And if you raise the minimum wage, the economic literature is united on the fact that lots of those entry-level jobs evaporate. We've got a crisis of youth work in this country. Being in an agricultural state, it's not quite as bad here as it is a lot of places, but it is really difficult for 16-year-olds and 18-year-olds and 20-year-olds to get that first job, and we shouldn't be taking away those rungs on the ladder of opportunity. But let's be clear, I believe that a lot of the advocates for a minimum wage increase are very well-meaning, well-intentioned people. I just think it'll benefit a few people, but it might harm a lot more. And what we really need is to grow the economy.
It hasn't changed. It hasn't been a vote for to increase the federal income or minimum wage rather since in 5 years. So 2009. So yes, no, vote for an increase now? Yes, just one word.
I don't think so.
Okay. Still plenty more to come in this special edition of KETV News Watch 7's Chronicle.
We have a lot more issues to talk about. We'll be right back. And you are watching a special Commitment 2014 edition of KETV News Watch 7's Chronicle. This morning we are taking a closer look at Nebraska's U.S. Senate race. In early August, Kentucky Senator Rand Paul stopped in Nebraska to announce his support for Ben Sasse.
Now, Paul is considering running for president in 2016. While he's officially a Republican, Paul has been closely identified with the Tea Party.
Well, welcome back. We are talking with Ben Sasse this morning.
Yeah, so what is it like to have all these big names backing you? People like Paul, Sarah Palin. Has that helped?
You know, we've appreciated the support we've gotten from all across the political spectrum, but I think the game-changing endorsement in our primary was the Nebraska Farm Bureau. It was only the second time in Nebraska history that the Farm Bureau has ever endorsed in a primary. They're the largest grassroots organization, 58,000 families, and we're campaigning hard in all 93 counties. 88 of the 93 have Farm Bureaus. That's really what's making a difference in this race, is the ground game of Nebraskans.
We haven't seen very much advertising from, you know, the Ben Sasse campaign. Are you holding it back in reserve and waiting to hit the air soon, or do you need it?
You know, our plan has always been to spend as much time and as much money and as much, you know, emotional energy as possible on the ground game. We don't think anybody has ever run a full 93 county campaign in a Nebraska general election. Candidates over the course of a primary and a general have passed through all 93 counties, but we have 93 county chairs. I've actively campaigned in all 93 counties, and soon we'll have been back in all 93 counties over the last 93 days. I think the ground game is so much more important than the air game, but, you know, we'll obviously be on TV at some point.
We talked about those fundraising numbers at the top of the show, over $1 million versus like $250,000 for Domina. One of the things he told me earlier was that I'm not getting that big money support because this is just me. This is my message. This is what I'm doing. Do you think that's a negative, that you have maybe Washington support or big money PAC support?
Yeah. I mean, you know that we've been running a constructive campaign, so we don't spend much time talking about our opponents. But this one's a little disingenuous because they say it everywhere they go. Here's the reality. According to the most recent financial disclosure, he has about 200 donors in Nebraska. We have 3,200 donors in Nebraska. So this is a Nebraska-based campaign. We just have a lot more support. We have a ground game, and we have a lot of people in every county turning out for us. So people like to say all this stuff about big money. Big money for us is really a lot and lot of Nebraskans all across the state. We're also grateful for some folks from across the country who've written checks, but this is a Nebraska-based campaign with kind of unprecedented ground support.
I want to hit a couple more briefly. Keystone XL pipeline. Your opponent has argued against the pipeline even in the Nebraska Supreme Court. You say in your material that the pipeline should have been approved years ago. I know TransCanada and some experts have said any kind of risk of leak or contamination is very minimal, but why even take that chance, even a very minimal chance?
Yeah, so let's put this in a bit broader context. We need an all-of-the-above energy strategy. We need to be growing the economy, we need to be creating jobs in Nebraska, and we need to be supplying energy and power to our houses and to our businesses, and so we should celebrate the broad range of diverse fuel sources that we have in this country, and we should be moving toward North American energy independence. There's a lot that's been happening in the Dakotas with the shale revolution that's really exciting. There's a lot that needs to happen to get the EPA out of the business of trying to shut down extant Nebraska power sources. I don't think a lot of Nebraskans fully understand that the most recent EPA rules are going to be an implicit tax on Nebraska households, where 2/3 of our energy comes from coal, primarily from West Virginia. So I'm in favor of an all-of-the-above strategy, and that does include Keystone. Obviously, my opponent is a really articulate guy and has ably spoken with his views about Keystone, and when you talk to Nebraskans on the ground, people are worried about eminent domain abuses nationally. But we need to approve the Keystone pipeline because it is the safest way, actually, to transport this stuff rather than via rail, which is what's happening right now. So every instance of extraction and every instance of transmission has some kind of risk, but it seems like the Obama administration's reading on this has been, and here I concur with their judgment, that this is actually the safest way to transport it as opposed to what's going by rail right now.
Well, we're going to take a short break now. Still ahead, though, the conversation continues.
Including the questions you want to ask. KETV News Watch 7 Chronicle continues.
And welcome back. We're talking with you, Republican U.S. Senate candidate Ben Sasse, special one-hour edition of KETV News Watch 7's Chronicle.
Well, what is your opinion? This is our first question for Mr. Sasse that we got from our viewers. Should medical marijuana be made legal?
I'm a federalist, so I believe the vast majority of governance should be delivered at the state and local level when possible. And so I would devolve more of these questions to the states. As a Nebraska citizen, I don't want us to have more marijuana, but I support the right of most issues to move to the states. We do have to recognize, though, Controlled Substances Acts are sometimes connected to treaties, so there are reasons why current federal law needs to be we need to proceed with caution, and I don't think this is a high priority issue. Nebraskans aren't talking about it on the trail.
We have people on both sides of us, though. Colorado and Iowa have medical marijuana.
Yeah, and I mean, Colorado's got lots of problems. You talk to law enforcement, not just in Colorado, but in the Panhandle in Nebraska now, there's a real fear about driving under the influence, and I think we can do better for our kids than this.
We have a question from a viewer. How much are you influenced by other party leaders or PACs that give you money with the expectation you'll vote a certain way and go along with a certain party line? Your response to that?
Yeah, I'm an American first, and I'm a Nebraskan, and I'm happy to be a Republican because I believe in many of the principles of my party, but I didn't run for office because of the party label behind your name. I'm running for office because I want us to pass along an opportunity-filled country to the next generation. And I think about President Reagan's great line, I'm grateful for a broad range of people who will endorse me, but they're endorsing me, I'm not endorsing them.
There was a debate earlier this month where a question about gun laws, the NRA came up, and there were some critics afterward who said, despite that, the NRA backing you, you didn't seem to know the issues. What else does he not know? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so people tried to make much ado about nothing there. I'm a big believer in the Second Amendment. Government doesn't give us rights. God gives us rights by nature, and government is our shared project to secure those rights, and I'm delighted to be the NRA-endorsed candidate in this race. I have support from all the gun groups in the country and in the nation, in the state, because ultimately, as a dad and as a husband and as a property owner, I have the right to defend my family and my property by nature, not because government gives me that right. In the debate, they tried to ask some technical questions about gun shows, and at the end of the day, this is sort of the gotcha stuff that I think Nebraskans are sick of. It turns out about 1.2% of all guns used in crimes didn't go via background check pathways, and so really we're focused on the wrong issues, and there were technical aspects to the question that I don't know every issue about what the NRA believes. Again, I'm glad to defend the Second Amendment. I'm glad that the NRA has endorsed me, but I don't pretend to have knowledge of every NRA position.
Let me ask you this. Do you think humans have a noticeable impact on climate change?
I think climate change science is really complicated. It appeared that there was a lot of climate change over the course of the last 50 to 75 years, and almost all of the models now show that there's been almost no climate change in the last 16 years. So I believe that, as my many scientist friends believe, that science needs to be very, very humble. There are cases where it seemed like, in our literature and debates, that humans were influencing it, but now their models are less clear than they used to be. The one thing I'm sure of is that when the sources of human potential contribution to climate change are primarily coming from China and from India and are going to spike in the two-thirds world primarily, we shouldn't bet our economic future in the U.S. on something that wouldn't have any actual effect on the long-term issue, because it's a global issue, it's not a U.S. centric issue. But when you travel our state, our people, our farmers and ranchers and people in Omaha and Lincoln as well, there's nobody that believes more in stewarding the environment than the people who live on the land and who are raising their kids on the land, or their livelihoods come from it, their wells are on it. Our people want to steward the environment, but they want to go slow before we give bureaucrats too much power about things they don't know everything about.
We'll be right back with some final thoughts from Ben Sasse. First, a reminder, your comments are such an important part of this show. You can call us, 402-978-8960. Also, try to be brief and speak clearly if you can.
You can always email us. Go to KETV.com, click on the Chronicle link. Love to hear from you. What do you think about this show? We'll be right back. And welcome back to the Special Commitment 2014 edition of KETV News Watch 7's Chronicle. This morning, we've talked with Ben Sasse about the inaction in Congress, jobs, Affordable Care Act, Tea Party.
But now, Mr. Sasse, it's your turn to speak out. We have about 2 minutes for you to speak directly to the voters and just tell them what matters most to you.
Great. Well, thank you for having me, and thanks to KETV. My family and I have had a wonderful year. We weren't looking to run for office. We love this state, and we're raising our kids about a mile from where I grew up so they can be detasseling corn and around cousins and grandparents and aunts and uncles. And we believe, like Nebraska families believe, that this is the center of the world. I believe in the private sector and job creation by Nebraskans who take risks and build something special for their neighbors and for their customers. And I believe in civil society and churches and neighborhood associations and the Rotary and the Little League and all the things that happen in our communities. Nebraska isn't broken, but Washington is broken. And we need to have a Washington that deals with the more important issues more urgently, more transparently, and with less partisan screaming. I believe we can do better for our kids and grandkids, and I think we have a moral obligation to pass along that great and free and opportunity-filled country to them. As President Reagan used to say, freedom doesn't go forward and a republic isn't transmitted by inertia of motion. It isn't an accident that America has passed on. We pass along the American idea to our kids because we teach it to them and we model it for them. As you travel this great state, and my wife and I and our 13 and 10 and 3-year-old kids have spent most of this year on a bus. We've spent active time campaigning in all 93 of our counties. Nebraskans still believe in America. They believe in what we owe our neighbors. They believe in our troops. They believe in their local communities. But they want a Washington that tries to do a more limited number of things, but the more important ones. And I'm honored to have a broad range of Nebraska grassroots organizations organizations like the Nebraska Farm Bureau and the NFIB endorsing me, and we look forward to the last 5 weeks of this campaign to continue coming to your neighborhood and to continue campaigning in all 93 counties talking about what America means. And I humbly ask for your consideration and your vote on November 4th. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. And that is our show this morning. We'll see you back here next Sunday.
Yeah, remember, we will post this show and next week's Chronicle online at KETV.com. That way you can watch, decide for yourself where Sasse and Domina stand on the issues that matter most to you.
Next week, we'll talk to the two independent candidates running for Senate, Jim Jenkins and Todd Watson.
Also, make plans now to vote. The election is November 4th. Early voting starts tomorrow. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.